that it's misogynist, demeaning of all women. But offensive as it might be, should such misogyny be a hate crime? After all, anybody who assaults you or harasses you will face a tougher punishment if you're black or disabled or transgender, and the judge believes that fact motivated their crime. But if you're a woman, even if your assailant tells you to your face that it's because you're female, it will make no difference to his sentence. Some campaigners say that killings like that of Sarah Everard's are fueled by misogynistic attitudes, encouraged by non-violent acts, verbal or social media hostility. They want a new law to put sex and gender on the same footing as race and disability. But the government's official advisors, the Law Commission, say that a new law could create more problems than it solves. For example, making the prosecution of domestic abuse even harder than it is now. Our choice: should misogyny be a hate crime? Or is the call for a new law just virtue signalling? In the next 60 minutes, two passionate believers come head-to-head in the search for common ground. With me tonight are the Conservative peer and former Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, Baroness Helen Newlove. She led efforts in the House of Lords to make misogyny a hate crime. And Ella Whelan, journalist and author of What Women Want: Fun, Freedom and an End to Feminism. OK, let's start, if I may, with you, Helen. Christian names here. Why do we need a new law?
We need a new law in a sense of the research as former Victims Commissioner, meeting many female victims, felt that as a woman they were absolutely demeaned, and it didn't form part of an aggravating factor in domestic abuse, sexual abuse. And having listened to, there's other people who have been involved with Stella Creasy MP, I think it's the part woman has been absolutely missed in high-end domestic abuse and sexual abuse crimes.
So when we say an aggravating factor, we don't mean a separate crime, but if you're assaulted or harassed in any way, you are liable to get more years or bigger fine or whatever it is because of that specific factor that it is against a person of a particular kind.
I think it's important to put that in as an aggravating factor and to make people aware. I did work with the judges within the House of Lords as well, because the government were relying on the Law Commission report. That was just the standard default answer to any questions raised. But working with a lot of women who have suffered and feel in fear of their lives, actually it was important that they recognise that, yes, you may be a Jewish woman and they've attacked you for anti-Semitism, or a Muslim woman, they've attacked you because you're Muslim, but actually they've also attacked them for being a woman as well, and that is being missed and has an effect that actually we're not breaking the cycle, and it's actually looking at the perpetrator instead of putting all the onus back on the victim. All
right, before we go on to the meat of it, why are you so interested in this personally? Because there are lots of other kinds of victims that you dealt with.
Yeah, I think A, as a mother of 3 daughters, and also as somebody who has been through the criminal justice system. I worked beforehand in the courts and then being on the other side, so to speak. I felt the system...
This is after your
After I lost my husband, Gary, in 2007. I think it's very interesting to see how the dynamics shift all the time. And as yes, Victims Commissioner for all victims of crime, but majority that I saw with domestic abuse and rape victims and sexual abuse victims, they felt very unsafe. They felt that actually by reporting a crime, which I met quite a few victims who went to report crime of rape, and it was very much dismissed. You know, you're not the only woman loved tonight, that you're going to be raped, which in itself is appalling, but the fact of they felt that because they were a woman.
OK. Ella Whelan, what harm can it do to give law enforcement officers an extra tool?
Well, I mean, spin that question and say, what harm can it do to give law enforcement officers more work to do, or expand their remit of how far they can delve into individuals' private lives? I think that's what I'm more concerned with. There's when you introduced my book, it tells you a lot about, you kind of smirked at the subheading, which lots of people do. They're kind of, oh, end to feminism, what does that mean? And I think that part of the... I'm delighted we're having this
I just think it's a rather daring thing to say these days.
Yeah, that's why I put it as the subheading. But I think it signals a lot that, you know, the discussion about, in particular, things like misogyny, hate crime, or whether or not, you know, you should be a feminist today is kind of a given. It's like, if you don't agree with this, you're either, you know, going along with internalised misogyny, you think that violence against women isn't that big a problem. And there's all these kind of assumptions that are made. In actual fact, I think that this kind of law change represents a real harm to women's freedom. And it's a bit of a tricky thing to explain, but I think that in the last sort of 20 and 30 years, contemporary feminism has moved away from an argument for women's freedom, independence, ability to risk and enjoy public life in the same way, to the same extent that men do. And we've moved more towards a focus on safety at the sacrifice of freedom. And I think that, in particular, something like hate crime really represents that, where you would be inviting police officers to have greater remit into looking into women's private lives, you know, being able to question people who say something nasty to a woman online, be able to keep personal details on files, to really act as a kind of, the insinuations that women need police officers to act as almost like a watchful older brother in order for us to move about our lives. And I think that I think, one, it insults women's independence, intelligence, authority and agency. But also, I don't think it does anything to address the real questions in society that we have to answer about women's status, women's position, women's the remaining sexism in society.
That's a broad outline. I wonder if you could, as I asked Baroness Newlove, why is it that you feel so strongly about this particular law? Because you write about all sorts of things, actually, some of which are to do with identity, some of which are to do with other issues.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to write the book and look into it further is because it can be irritating when people ask that question, because I think women always feel beholden to say, well, as a victim of something like this, or because I've suffered this level of abuse, whatever. And yeah, you know, meet a woman who hasn't had a bad word said to them by a man. Most women have. But I've always been more interested, rather than the kind of, you know, personal anecdote, to look at what is the future of the status of women in this society. And there is so much that has to be done, whether it's in relation to childcare provision, abortion. I'm sure we'll get into all of that, all the rest of it. I want to push forward for a future of women's freedom and leave behind this rather patronising idea that we're sort of fainting maidens in need of a knight.
Yeah, I don't think there's any fainting maidens in this studio. But let me just get one thing clear. I mentioned the Mail on Sunday story. Do you both agree that the story itself, or the way it's presented, falls under the banner of misogyny?
I just thought it was gutter press, to be perfectly honest. I just think it was very demeaning to both Angela Rayner as a woman and as an MP in a House of Commons. Angela can quite vocally stick up for herself as a northern woman, but I just thought that's the lowest of the low. And politically, I don't think it did the government any goodness, in a sense of, why would you do that? That's, you know, but it's highlighting misogyny. But again, like Ella just said, you know, we don't need a knight in shining armour. Certainly Angela doesn't know, but it did knock Angela as well. And so for me, that, you know, it was an appalling story to put out there about a political world that's already, you know, hard for women. Do
you agree?
I agree it was completely crass and sexist, and I think it's more embarrassing for the Tories because no one is not going to be on Angela's side. And I don't think anyone took it seriously either. But also, I'd like to add to that, the desire to kind of then extrapolate from, you know, one article in one paper on the basis of unnamed sources, to then extrapolate from that to suggest that there is a problem with misogyny more broadly in society, or indeed that there's now the suggestion that the Speaker has to get involved with ticking off a paper as Speaker of the House. I think that tells you something about do I even want to use the word, yeah, I do, the panic around misogyny, hatred of women, this very serious thing, that it's sort of just everywhere, that this piece by this one individual represents a generalised hatred for women, either in the Houses of Parliament or indeed in wider society. I don't agree with that.
All right. Let's first look at the case that you've made, Helen, for this change, and some of the objections. First of all, that actually the Law Commission's basic proposition, which is that it wouldn't be practical, that rather like some other pieces of legislation, forced marriages to that and so on, it frankly wouldn't be used very much because it's very hard to prove. The standard of proof would be standard of evidence would be extremely high, and it would take police effort away from more serious, more immediate crimes.
My answer to that is police are under-resourced anyway, and we don't see police officers. So let's put this in context at the centre of all this, because the Law Commission report, it felt that they weren't looking for a solution. They were finding a default button to actually not solve the issue. My point is, and from my background, I've seen too many women demean, and these aren't women who are faint. I'm very much for the suffragettes and the power. And I think, you know, what Ella said about childcare, about how women perceived are absolutely, you know, it's not right. As a mother of 3 daughters, I can tell you they're very vocal in what they're doing. But the whole point is that the Law Commission really didn't answer what we wanted them to answer. And for me, what was missing in our criminal justice system is aggravating factors. If we put that to one side, you can get a case where they're charged with murder and they've raped their victim, but that rape won't follow through because the murderer is the higher of the end of the two, where actually victims' families want them charged with the murder, so with the rape, sorry. So I think it's about the aggravating factor. It's understanding what that woman's gone through, and you know, to say we don't want police, they're already under-resourced doing that. The fact that Sue Fish from Nottingham was actually looking at, you know,
she was the chief of police
at the time. I think it's really important that I think it's, for me, when I started this amendment and this conversation, it's opened a lot of can of worms as well. And I think there's a lot of dynamics we need to add to this for people on the ground to fully understand what we mean by it.
Well, I think it is important to fully understand what is meant by it. And actually, I mean, you made a great speech defending your amendment, Helen, at the time. But one of the things that you said in that was that this wasn't just about, you know, things that I think generally most people would accept are do no harm, collecting data, finding out how much of this stuff is happening. You know, who could argue with that? But you made the point that this was about sending a message that that the law would be used to send a social message to say that this isn't acceptable. Now, I, as someone who generally opposes a government overreach into people's private lives, and actually I'm opposed to hate crime in general, because I think it's slightly ludicrous to suggest that either you can police emotions through hate. I'm not entirely convinced that a slap in the gob hurts more if someone's hitting me because I'm a woman or because I'm 5'8" or whatever. But that aside, I think this suggestion that people have to rely on the law to change social norms is completely the wrong way around. If you look at the way in which women have got into, you know, where we are in 2022, over the last few decades, it's not been through, with the greatest respect, people in the House of Lords or politicians instituting laws and the rest of us saying, oh, what a good idea. It's been through grassroots movements of, you know, feminist campaigns, women campaigns, of arguing our position in society. And it's a bit of a tricky point to make, but I think that today, and it's one that people kind of find too controversial to take on, but I think it's true, I think we have to have more of a sense of women and men being able to stand up individually and, you know, in public against this kind of bad behaviour, rather than relying on legislation to fix the problem for you. Because things like, you know, murder, rape, indecent exposure, assault, domestic violence, all of these things are illegal already.
I want to come back to this point about resilience in a moment after the break when we talk about your case. But, Helen, the heart of what Ellen's just said, actually, refers to something that you said, I think, in your speech in the House of Lords, where you said misogyny with violence, hatred, abuse and entitlement that some hold in their hearts towards women. Can you really legislate against what somebody has in their heart?
I think hate is a behaviour. It's from, you know, the behaviour, attitude to ways they treat the women. So I think it follows through. That's why it's got to be an aggravating factor. You can't legislate hate the word, but I think it's behaviours that follow through their actions that you can legislate.
OK. What about the issue of the practicality of this? Because it's been raised again and again that actually it sounds right, but, for example, that there's a sort of spread. Ella said that she's worried about hate crime in general, but, for example, we now have in London adverts that say don't stare. Should staring at somebody on a train be potentially illegal?
Well, I've not seen them adverts in London, and I've not seen them in the north.
They're all
you
over
see.
the tube.
Are they all over the tube? Right. So ignore my ignorance in that sense. No, I think there has to be context to this. I think the context is if, you know, at the end of the day, if somebody's staring, it depends if that person is constantly on the tube and doing that, it puts you in fear. I think there should be discussions, but I don't think even police officers will come out for just staring. I think sometimes we have to have a proper conversation about this, and from working with victims and listening to the criminal justice system, I think it is a big gap about understanding what women go through. And that is why they've got no confidence to go forward in maybe going to the police, reporting it. But most importantly, personally, I don't think there should be prosecution for somebody staring at you. That's a common sense ground.
But you see the problem here that some people would say that the point about misogyny is that it is a feeling, it's not an act.
Yes.
And that you end up with a wide spectrum, which might, for example, start to criminalise flirtation. And I don't suppose anybody wants to do that, do they?
But I think sometimes women feel if there's somebody being flirtatious to you, they do feel very intimidated. Not because they're weak and they're not because they can't stick up for themselves, but actually a situation, and I know personally from losing my husband, within seconds can get very volatile, can get very violent. So I think at the end of the day, I think it depends, when you say these words, it depends on the actions and the behaviour of that individual towards that person that feels in fear for themselves.
Which is why the problem with the law is that it's a blunt instrument, and indeed if you look at, for example, there was this recent poll done from a teachers' union back in April, where it found that 70% of teachers reported that they had suffered some form of misogyny. You think, oh, terrible headline, what's going on in schools? You then read down the report and find out that one of the things that teachers are reporting are that children make sexist comments about women at home, and they say that feminism is a terrible thing. Now, that might be a political position you disagree with, but certainly not hatred of women. And I think there is a real blurring of the lines about what misogyny constitutes. And indeed, these kind of important grey areas in people's relationships between men and women, whereas, no, I completely agree with you. I'm glad you say that you don't think staring would be criminalised. But if someone suggested that they were being stared at as a form of sexual harassment, then you can quite clearly see how reporting that to the police could result in a hate crime report. And that's a problem, because if you're being stared at by some lech you don't want to be stared at, that's a problem. If you're being stared at by someone you fancy, it's completely different. These are the grey areas in society that matter.
All right, stay with us. We're going to be testing the ground a bit further, but it already looks like we're beginning at least to have some agreement that there's some limits here. But we still have to see what the grey areas are and what is white and what is black. Back in a moment.
The 60th anniversary is a critical milestone for us. It's a moment of reflection, looking at who we have been, how we have been, and where we are going. So for us, it's a matter of glorying in our culture, the things that have made us who we are, and this confluence of cultures and ethnicity that has woven itself into the Jamaican mosaic. And our forefathers saw it well by having a motto, out of many, one people. That's who Jamaica really is, out of many, one people. And we want to glory in that diversity and to show the world that our rich culture and our diverse offerings represent a little piece of them. We are a small island state, but the largest in the English-speaking Caribbean, characterized by very strong biodiversity, lush green vegetation, warm climate. We have a temperate climate running through the entire year. We have wonderful waterfalls and stalagmites and stalactites and food. Jamaica is known for its cuisine. Excellent food, delicious and delectable Jamaican cuisine.
Y con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas. Y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
We support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.
Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Conservative peer and former Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, Baroness Helen Newlove, and the journalist and author Ella Whelan. We're talking about whether misogyny should be made a hate crime. Ella, why shouldn't women have the same kind of protection against prejudice that people of colour or LGBT people?
Well, I mean, I think it's a convincing argument to, you know, that why are women left out? And I could, I don't want to, we could make our head spin by bringing in the whole discussion about the fact that lots of politicians at the moment can't decide what a woman actually is. Let's not go there.
Let's not go there.
But, you know, so I understand the argument for wanting to include it in hate crime legislation. But I would actually say, instead of adding to the list, why don't we look at and question why we need or want to have hate crime legislation. If it's just about collecting data, then I'm sure there are other ways we can do that without adding to the statute books and adding to legislation. Let's be innovative here. But actually, I don't think it's about that. I think it's about a general trend to want to try to, as you said, look into people's hearts, try to police thought, police how we speak to each other, police what we think about each other, and police politics. I mean, we see this happening most pointedly on social media. You know, there have been, I mean, to take the trans example, there have been several instances of individuals being arrested for things that they've said on social media that delves into a critical realm of being critical of gender ideology, for example. So we know that this isn't just a kind of nicey nice, let's just figure out the data and get the world better for minorities. This is about trying to influence public opinion on certain political positions in relation to religion, in relation to race, whatever it is. I think that's a real problem. You cannot police hate. And also, I don't think we should, this is a kind of funny point, but I don't think we should be so single-minded about the emotion of hate, because indeed, if you make, you know, obviously hatred is not a good thing and in the abstract, but people hate their living conditions, they hate the politicians they're represented by, they hate the world they live in, they want to change things. You know, hate has been a driving revolutionary force throughout history in a way. And so I get very itchy about the idea that we would want to police and demonise hate in this kind of particular way.
That's true. All of that is true. But we're speaking now about the piece of law that Helen Newlove introduced, which was to make misogyny, anti-woman sentiment, let's put it that way, an aggravating factor in crimes like violence or harassment and so on. Do you not accept that part of the law is to express desirable social norms. You know, we have laws about levels of noise. We have laws about what parts of your body you can expose and not expose in public. Why shouldn't there be laws that basically guide us to where what sort of violence we think is particularly heinous or unacceptable because it's associated with feelings toward a particular group of people? Bear in mind, this isn't, you know, we're talking about crimes that might not be, that are usually not necessarily against somebody that you know, they're just against a person because of what they are. There's not something they can do anything about.
I mean, there is this, I mean, to really badly paraphrase, I think it was Germaine Greer who made this point, there is this sort of, you know, odd suggestion that violence against women, in particular rape, is somehow a much worse crime than other forms of violence. I think we need to interrogate that idea that, you know, there is so much, not that the focus is a wrong thing, but that there is so much prioritisation of that you would have to have a hate crime to inform a societal view of violence against women, as opposed to two guys beating each other up or something else. And I think that part of the, you know, let's be clear here, I'm not trying to equate the two, because we do have come out of sexist societies. You know, history tells us that women have been denigrated where men haven't over the decades and centuries, and so two men beating each other up is not the same as a man beating up a woman. It has different historical meaning and it's loaded differently. But I just don't, perhaps it's my politics and my sense of democracy, and that I don't think that law should instruct the plebs. I think that people and publics inform social norms.
Helen.
But I think as somebody who's seen a level of violence that I did and my daughters have seen, I think the impact of the emotion of violence is where we need to protect women. Because at the end of the day, we can, you know, religion and, you know, sex and everything else, but the fact that a woman has been demonised, been brutally attacked through hate, and we've now got more children through domestic abuse families who see the woman as the lower class in the family. I do think we need to be common sense about this. It's not about creating more laws. It's actually understanding that impact has not had an effect on the sentence. It's more to do with their religion, their colour, and for me, as somebody who's seen a level of violence and has seen so many victims who feel demeaned, feel that people don't understand because they're the women, that's okay and everything. I feel that we're stepping backwards in a sense of that we're not supporting this piece of legislation to make sure women are in the aggravating factor for the criminal justice. Now, that's the far end, because not everybody goes to court. We're seeing that the lowest rates for conviction for charging for rape victims. But I think as a society, I think we've become so PC, people are scared of doing anything or reacting anything. When I lost Gary, people were scared of going out to the streets. It's not that simple. And I just think, in essence, when I've listened to this, I think it's so important that we have a common sense approach to this. And it's not just about the law, it's about people having faith to come forward and have that opening ear from a police officer.
I think it's a really important point that, you know, you characterise it as us being more PC, and I think that we're certainly more nervous about each other, more nervous in the way we talk to each other, partly because there has been a real drive for censorship in politics to suggest that there are just some things you can't say, and that section of the things you can't say expands.
I say it to my 90-year-old mum, you know, she comes out with words, massive, Mum, you can't say things like that. She said, I'm 90, what are you going to do, put me on the naughty step?
But I think that bringing in this kind of legislation, or indeed any kind of regulatory measures, you know, not just law, but policies in workplaces, you know, policies in universities that have kind of speech codes or things like that, only drives a further wedge between citizens' ability to interact with each other, because the public life is only healthy when it has a rough and tumble, a to and fro. And if we get to a situation in which, you know, particularly in relationships between men and women, heterosexual relationships and interactions, there is always this barrier of the police officer or this threat of legislative action. I think that's just going to make people more nervous and less willing to have that. You know, it's going to make women less willing to say, hang on a minute, what you just said is wrong and bad, and don't say it. And I think that's a much more natural way of changing people's minds.
All right, I want to stick with this point, but we're going to go to break. We've heard some of what our guests think and why. Next, we're going to try to begin the search for common ground, though I think we are getting towards something like a common understanding. But there's a couple of things to sort out first. See you in a moment.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Conservative peer and former Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, Baroness Helen Newlove, and the journalist and author Ella Whelan. And we're talking about whether misogyny should be made a hate crime. We've found out some of what our guests think, and we're now going to try to see if we can move towards some kind of common ground, or possibly not. Before we get there, Ella, let me ask you about this. Many people who support the idea of misogyny as a hate crime make the point that the extreme end of violence against women, coercive control and so on, is not entirely separate from what might seem like small issues which you said we need to build up people's resilience against. But do you not accept that there is a case for what in another context they might call the broken windows strategy here. You need to deal with the small things, because if you don't deal with those small things, they create an environment in which the big crimes, the horrible crimes, take place with more frequency.
Well, I think two things can be true at the same time. The first is that, quite obviously, the reason why men commit violence against women in the numbers that they do, in particular, levels of domestic violence, it has a direct relationship to women's standing in society. It's about, historically the way in which women were positioned, particularly in a domestic violence setting, which is about keeping a woman under control at home in horrible coercive fashion. To suggest that has nothing to do with politics of women's history or women's standing in society, that would be ludicrous. The thing that is simultaneously true is that it would also be ridiculous to suggest that, which I think happens far too often from some of my feminist comrades, is that just because an individual wolf whistles, says crass things, maybe pushes it too far on a common, or even, goes as far as groping or things like that, that will automatically, that leads in this sliding scale, as it's put, towards things like rape and violence and very serious crimes. Now, obviously there are, we know that with the individual Wayne Couzens, in the case of Sarah Everard, there was an individual who did move through a sliding scale of behaviour from indecent exposure and watching violent pornography right up to committing rape and murder. I think we just need to preach caution when we try and suggest that bringing in punitive measures for what we've talked about as the grey areas of society, how people interact, would solve the problem of rape and sexual assault and violence and murder, because I just don't think that's the case. And more importantly, really quickly, I think that what criminalising and panicking about those lower end of the behaviour scale things does is freak women out. It causes fear among women. In fact, in Nottinghamshire, the report proved that the introduction of hate crime made loads more women feel like looking over their shoulder and nervous, which I'm not comfortable with.
Do you buy that?
But that's a fair point, but isn't that perception that's down to communication? It wasn't to make people fear, it was to make people have confidence, to know that actually they can report and be believed. And I think, like you say, the sliding scale with Wayne Couzens, it shows again that he was allowed the movement as a police officer and the culture of how women are treated. And as I say, I'm quite a gobby northerner, and I've read things where you said, you've been brought up tough and everything. But there is also occasions where actually enough is enough, and women can be very vulnerable. We have problems still in this country with stalking, and the sliding scale leads to more serious violent crimes with a loss of life. And we have this reactiveness in this country to do something after the horse has bolted. And instead, this misogyny, the amendment I wanted, was to ensure that it's enshrined in an aggravating factor, and we would break the cycle and actually put the onus on the perpetrator or the guy or the woman, this misandry, this misogyny, is actually to say this is not the correct behaviour. And as an example, in the schools that you gave me 70% with sexism and everything, I think, this is where we've become too PC in a sense. We can't have a common ground conversation because people are very nervous because it's going into areas that actually could be called racist, about, Muslim people, or anything like that. It's become very toxic. We've created it. And I am in the political world, but my P is about people and understanding. And I do not like the window dressing, which I feel Sarah Everard's case became window dressing for politics. And actually, the people who wanted to support
When you say
campaign,
window dressing press politics, what do you mean?
I mean that the headlines sound wonderful, but you're not meaning what you say on the tin, which is how I came into as a campaigner for victims and what I went through for my family. I've had many conversations with previous prime ministers, but the fact is that you can lose sight. I'm a Conservative peer, but at the end of the day, surely we are all here to do the best for the public. We saw that with the pandemic. We all used to clap for the nurses and whatever, but I don't know. I think that the society's become very toxic. Hate has become very at the top. People are really angry, and now we've got the poverty line. Everything's been spewed into it. So I think there is an issue about hate per se. It's about behaviour, and I think we need to tackle perpetrators to stop that cycle.
Just on this point, I want to talk about where you might meet, I guess, in the middle. But just on this point about the, if you like, social norms, Ella, there is, I don't want to go all sociology lecturer on you, but there is a theory which is evidence that if you can make a group of people seem a bit less human than everybody else by creating a stereotype, for example, that, you know, women are just passive and so on, then it is easier to do horrid things to them. And this is not about an individual, but it's about the society overall. Do you not buy that at all?
I do buy that, actually. And I think that part of the problem with this kind of legislation is it is really buying into the idea that women are more passive and more in need of protection. And, I often say the same thing you say in Gobby Northern. I'm a Gobby East Londoner. And, but, the flip side of that is a woman can come along and say, well, I'm a very shy person, I'd never speak up. And there's nothing wrong with that. Shouldn't be, that's not anything to criticise. But on an individual basis, but on a political basis, I think we need to start getting serious about saying that women are just as rough and tough and able as men and able to deal with adversity in society that faces them. Now, that's not a popular opinion because that means me telling women, right, no, you're not shouldn't confront someone when they stop you at 3 o'clock in the morning in an alley. I'm not an idiot, and I don't want women to get hurt. But in those low-level, end of the scale, the things we've been talking about, whether it's, sexist comments or things like that, I think we do have to get more serious about having a grassroots response to this, which is women pulling on the hobnail boots and metaphorically, or perhaps not, and giving men who need it a kick in the backside, by, politically and physically, by saying, then that's how you change the perception of women as passive and weak and in need of protection.
Do you accept that there's an element of this in that picking out women in a way suggests that women need looking after?
No, I think that's the wrong context. I respect what Ella said, in a sense. As I say, I'm a mother with 3 daughters and I've got friends who can actually say this. This is about understanding there is a percentage of women who are continuously being harassed by men, who are continuously have actions by men and can lead to serious violence because she was a woman. This isn't about saying we're going backwards and women are weak. No, they're not. But there is a percentage of women, and within our criminal justice system, take the politics out of this, that's why I don't do the window dressing, is to say that actually they've got no confidence to go to the agencies that should be there to protect them. By all means, give them the confidence to do, but don't demean them as soon as they set foot to say, I feel that I'm, hate crime or I've been attacked. Because actually you're going to miss a percentage of women who are being actually harassed with violent men and domestic abuse and sexual abuse, who then feel that actually, well, we're already saying going to be weak.
All right, let me, we have to move on to think about what we could do.
Yeah.
Let me just take a couple of minutes to ask you both about a couple of possibilities. I mean, one thing we could do is what Law Commission has suggested. Don't change the big law, as it were, but extend the law which currently exists on race and religion against stirring up hatred, language that stirs up hatred. Extend that to sex and gender. Why not just do that as a start?
OK. Well, I don't think that covers a lot. I think that's how do you then actually persuade the rule of law to say, actually, you were stirring up hatred. Because, again, it's about hatred and it's about an emotion, it's about behaviour. So it is in there, and it may actually come to that victim who is a woman. There is men, there is men here, we can't dismiss that, but majority are women of this crime. So, I mean, that seems to be a bit like you're not really you're sitting on the fence, you're not actually standing up because it's too difficult to solve.
I just really oppose any law that suggests that, in particular, that speech should be policed. I mean, I don't think it's an accident that this amendment has come within the police bill, which is an incredibly illiberal, punitive, terrible piece of legislation that cracks down. It's a huge bill. It's too big. That cracks down on all kinds of freedoms. Let's not go there, but I mean, it should be shot down in every case. But the fact that this isn't about. Let's just get real here. This is not about the Conservative Party thinking, how can we make nice life for women? This is about the Conservative Party moving with a trend to police behaviour and thought.
And that's not where I come in. I'm on about people I've met on the ground. I'm about women who feel that they're not being believed. And I've got people who are in violent relationships who have no confidence to go forward. And the only way we can do that is making this aggravating factor.
All right, Trevor's attempt to find a way through here, number one, failed. Number two, Ella, it's not just the Conservative Party. The Scottish National Party, led by a woman, wants to bring in the idea, the law, that misogyny would be a hate crime. Why not? Let's put it this way. Let's see what happens in Scotland. Think about Scotland as a pilot. Why not?
Well, I mean, Scotland as a pilot is a terrifying fact. The SNP on various other pieces of legislation relating to freedom of speech are heinous. Let's be clear on that. They, want to engage in the policing of citizens' behaviour from what they think to what they say online, offline. And I think that it's not just me sounding off about my pet peeve, which is censorship. It's actually relevant to this, which is that, particularly in Scotland, there is this, within the SNP, let's be clear, there is this desire to control how citizens interact with each other. That is not how a democracy should be moving.
This isn't about controlling, and I totally agree. I think we should have freedom of speech. This is about behaviour.
But this wouldn't give freedom of speech, this kind of law.
No, it wouldn't, but it would help the people that actually are suffering. I agree there's tough women out there, and I agree we're not weak, but actually I think we have a common ground where actually I want to make sure people who need this law are protected, but I don't want actually police powers to stop freedom of speech.
All right. I, of course, have to make the point that the SNP are not here to explain or defend their point of view. That will be for another programme. We're going to go to break now. But we've heard really pretty thoroughgoing discussion from our guests, and they've heard from each other. In a moment, I'm going to ask them if either them sees any prospect for common ground based on what they've heard, and I'll give you my view. Stay with us.
The plan is to take the political temperature midweek, so we'll be discussing the biggest stories of the week so far, talking about what's still to come, having a look at Prime Minister's questions, of course, and getting a reaction from politicians, plus our very own viewers. And we'll have analysis from my Sky News colleagues.
The Take with Sophie Rich on Sky News.
I'm David Blevins, and I'm Sky's senior Ireland correspondent. I'm based in Belfast, a city transformed by peace, but still struggling with its past. Politically, the two sides are as far apart as ever, and it's over that question of who has sovereignty in Northern Ireland, the very issue that's been the source of tension here for generations. It takes 60 minutes to cross the Irish Sea. It took the British monarchy a century. I've spent 25 years reporting the journey from conflict to peace.
The political parties of Northern Ireland have reached agreement.
We help you understand the world with us.
Today, we have reached an agreement with the Conservative Party on support for government in Parliament.
We already know what the government gets out of this deal. What exactly does the DUP get out of it? Well, £1.5 billion. Welcome to Winterfell. It's an iconic location in this globally acclaimed drama. Ophelia was the most powerful hurricane this far east in the Atlantic on record. You can't live in a place like this and not appreciate the environment.
con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas. Y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
Welcome back. This is Common Ground. I'm joined by Conservative peer and former Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, Baroness Helen Newlove, and the journalist and author Ella Whelan. We've been talking about whether misogyny should be made a hate crime. We're coming to the end now, so I'm going to give each of you a minute to tell me what you feel you might have learned from our discussion, and if anything you've heard has actually changed your mind. Helen.
It's been a very interesting discussion, and I take on board some of the comments that Ella has said. However, I still haven't changed my mind. I think it's not about blocking freedom of speech. I think it's about protecting those women and those victims and not actually having something happen to them where we have another big outcry and somebody's lost their life. So to me, I do think we need to close this gap and to make people safe and that they can report it.
Ella?
Well, I'm a stubborn mule. I'm not going to change my mind when it comes to women's freedom, because I think that some of the greatest threats to women's autonomy today are from a knee-jerk, patronising style of contemporary feminism that has sacrificed women's freedom for safety. And I want that to change. But, you know, I'm with 100% Helen on the seriousness of some of the stuff that women face, whether it's in particular in relation to domestic violence, which I think, you know, does not get enough of a hearing. And some of the people on my side like to play down the issue of sexism. Society say, you know, we've moved on, there's nothing to talk about. There most definitely is something to talk about, so I'm with you there. But I think that the way we talk about it is not to institute punitive legislation, but to have a grassroots, bottom-up reigniting of women's power. Call me old school, but I'm more inspired by the movements in the 60s and 70s of women putting up their fist, metaphorically and physically, to sexism than I am by either amendments introduced in the Lords or legislation that seeks to treat women, I think, a lot of the time like children.
Well, look, thank you both very much. I've learned quite a lot in this. I think what we can definitely agree is that both of you regard this and the treatment of women as a serious issue. There's nobody in this discussion who doesn't think that there is a particular question to be answered. I think that if there's a beginning difference, it may not be about the issue of misogyny itself, but more about whether legislation can do anything to tackle the problem that you both agree. Ella is obviously less persuaded about that. You, Helen, are more so. Ella, I'm a little bit uneasy about the sense that you think that you can build resilience. I think that the challenges for some women are much greater than in my view, than one might imagine. Helen, I wonder whether actually you have too much faith in legislation. One thing we didn't talk about is whether there should be more resources for tackling this, and I suspect that both of you might agree that we do need that. But I think what you both agree about is that we do need to talk about this issue, and we talk about it openly, and some aspects of it are particularly tricky because they involve both assessments of men and indeed some groups of men and some cultures within our communities and so on. So we'll probably return to this. We haven't got kumbaya today. I don't think we've got common ground. But actually, what we've got, interestingly, I think is two quite different views of modern feminism. And that, I think, has given me an idea for a further edition of Common Ground. But to you who've been watching, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We'll see you next week.
con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas. Y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
I love my job because I get to do something that is contributing to a better future.
It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, live from Dnipro in eastern Ukraine. Our top story. The Russian onslaught in Ukraine's south and east. Sky News reports from two cities under constant bombardment.
Well, again, this place has come under attack. They've managed to get everybody out of the village, but we need to leave now too.
Putin's revenge. Russia cuts off gas supplies to Poland and Bulgaria as tensions grow between Moscow and the West.
Also coming up on the programme, missing, presumed dead. Detectives investigating the disappearance of Katie Kenyon arrest a man on suspicion of murder. Plus, a double whammy for renters. As monthly payments rise, so too do the threats of eviction.
Without any prior notice, notice of eviction came through the door. And I was literally, I was in a state of shock.